There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, the familiar weight of a blanket, the low murmur of a television playing a movie neither of you is watching. You don't recognize them as tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface of your world. You only feel the tremor later, when you look back and realize that was the exact second everything you thought was solid ground began to change, rearranging the entire landscape of your heart. For me, that moment smelled like the lavender fabric softener on my sweatshirt and the faint, clean scent of Julian's hair, and it was defined by the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his breathing against my chest. He was asleep, a deep, surrendered sleep that had become a familiar fixture in the architecture of my evenings. His head rested in the crook of my shoulder, one arm slung loosely across my stomach, his hand curled into a gentle fist just above my hip. The television cast a flickering blue light across the living room, painting his features in shifting shades of cobalt and silver. I could trace the line of his jaw, the soft curve of his lips, the dark sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek. My own breathing was a shallow, carefully metered thing, a conscious effort not to disturb the fragile peace of this moment, this impossible closeness that had become our ritual. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs, terrified that its desperate rhythm would wake him, that he would pull away and the space between us would once again become a chasm measured in propriety and the unspoken rules of our friendship. I was a cartographer of these small distances, and for months, I had been watching him slowly, inexplicably, fold the map. This was the precipice. I knew it in the way a sailor knows a change in the weather, a subtle shift in the pressure of the air. The boundary between friendship and something else had grown so thin it was translucent. I could see the shape of what lay on the other side, a terrifying and beautiful country I had only ever allowed myself to visit in dreams. And in the quiet stillness of my living room, with the weight of him a solid, grounding presence, I felt a single, paralyzing thought crystallize in my mind. I could not go back. Whatever happened when he woke up, whether he shifted away with a mumbled apology or stayed exactly where he was, the world we had inhabited before this moment was gone forever. I had led him this close, and in doing so, I had confessed everything without saying a single word. The silence was screaming. To understand the gravity of that silence, you would have to understand Julian. And to understand Julian, you have to understand the light he carried. We met in college, a collision of orbits that felt both random and preordained. I was a quiet observer, a photography student who lived behind a lens, more comfortable capturing moments than participating in them. My world was a carefully curated collection of frames, of light and shadow, of compositions that made sense. Julian was the opposite of a still frame. He was motion, energy, a supernova of easy laughter and boundless enthusiasm contained within the body of a Division I swimmer. He moved through the world with an unburdened grace that I, with my freight of anxieties and unspoken feelings, could only ever watch with a kind of reverent envy. Our friendship was, from the outside, an unlikely pairing, the quiet artist and the gregarious athlete. But beneath the surface, we fit. He filled my silences not with noise, but with a comfortable presence that never demanded a response. He had a way of seeing past the camera, of looking at me and not the carefully constructed image I presented to the world. He would sit on the floor of my makeshift darkroom, a tiny, windowless closet that always smelled of developer and fixative, and just watch me work. He'd ask questions, not about the technical aspects of f-stops and shutter speeds that bored most people, but about the feeling I was trying to capture. He understood, instinctively, that a photograph for me wasn't about documenting reality, but about translating an emotion into a tangible form. He saw the language I spoke, even if I rarely used my voice. In turn, I offered him a harbor. His life, for all its outward brightness, was a relentless churn of pressure. The punishing schedule of morning and afternoon practices, the academic demands of his software engineering major, the social expectations that came with being one of the university's star athletes. With me, he could shed that skin. He could be quiet. He could complain about the ache in his shoulders or the impossible complexity of a coding problem, and I would just listen. I was the anchor, the still point in his spinning world. It was a symbiosis that worked, a friendship built in the quiet spaces, in the shared understanding that we gave each other a kind of permission to be our truest, least performative selves. He was the only person who had ever seen the prints I deemed too personal to show anyone else, the ones that were less about composition and more about a raw, aching loneliness. He never said they were sad. He just said he understood them. My feelings for him didn't arrive in a thunderclap. It was more like the slow, patient process of a photograph developing in a chemical bath. An image emerging gradually from the ether, indistinct at first, then sharpening, the lines becoming clearer, the contrast deepening until it was an undeniable truth I could no longer ignore. It started with an awareness of small things. The way he'd run a hand through his damp hair after practice, the specific cadence of his laugh when he found something genuinely funny, the focused intensity in his eyes when he was trying to solve a problem, his brow furrowed in concentration. These were just details, fragments of the whole, but my mind began to hoard them like treasures. I started framing photos in my head, compositions built around the curve of his smile or the way light caught in his eyes. He became my unwitting muse. The turning point, the moment the image in the developer tray became irrevocably clear, was during our junior year. He was dating Sarah then. She was perfect for him, or at least, perfect for the version of him the world saw. Bright, bubbly, the captain of the cheerleading squad. They looked like a photograph from a university prospectus, the golden couple. I liked Sarah truly. She was kind, and she made Julian happy. But watching them together was like looking at the sun. I could only do it for a few seconds before I had to look away, spots dancing in my vision. There was an ache, a low, persistent hum of longing that I learned to file away under the category of friendship. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. One afternoon, I was shooting the swim team's practice for the student paper. I was at the far end of the pool, trying to capture the explosive power of the swimmers launching off the blocks. Through my telephoto lens, the world was a narrow, focused circle. I followed Julian, tracking his powerful strokes as he sliced through the turquoise water. He finished his lap, pulling himself out of the pool in one fluid motion. Water streamed from his hair, slicking it back from his forehead, and sluiced over the hard, defined muscles of his back and shoulders. He stood there for a moment, catching his breath, chest rising and falling, completely unaware of my gaze. And in that isolated frame, removed from the context of the noisy, chlorine-scented natatorium, he was just beautiful. It wasn't an aesthetic appreciation, it was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that knocked the air from my lungs. The photograph I took in that split second was technically perfect, the lighting, the composition, the captured motion, but I never showed it to anyone. It felt too much like a confession. It was the moment I stopped lying to myself. The feeling had a name, and that name was love. Knowing this changed nothing and everything. On the surface, our friendship remained the same. We still spent hours in the library, his laptop next to my editing software. We still had our late-night talks, our easy camaraderie. But for me, a new layer of complexity had been added to every interaction. A casual touch on the arm from him would send a jolt through my entire system. I became hyper-aware of the space between us, a physical distance that felt charged with unspoken potential. I learned to be a masterful actor, keeping my expression neutral, my voice steady, while a storm raged inside me. I was terrified that a single misplaced glance, a moment of unguarded honesty in my eyes, would betray me and shatter the most important relationship in my life. The foundation of our friendship was solid, but I feared my feelings were a fault line running right through it, a seismic vulnerability that could bring the whole structure crashing down. So I buried it. I built walls around that part of my heart, reinforcing them with the bricks of platonic affection and the mortar of self-preservation. Julian was my best friend. That had to be enough. And for 2 years, it was. The first crack in that foundation appeared not from my side, but from his. It came in the form of a phone call late on a rainy Tuesday in October, 6 months after we'd graduated. We lived in the same city now, a comforting point of continuity in the disorienting new world of adult life. I was in my apartment, which doubled as my studio, meticulously arranging negatives on a light table, the city lights blurring into soft, abstract shapes through my rain-streaked window. My phone buzzed, and Julian's name flashed on the screen. I answered with the easy, familiar greeting we always used. "Hey man, what's up?" Silence. Not the comfortable silence we often shared, but a heavy, waterlogged silence. I could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven, and the distant sound of traffic. My own breath caught in my throat. "Jules? You there?" "She left," he said, and his voice was a raw, broken thing I had never heard before. It was the sound of a pillar crumbling. "Sarah. She just packed her things and left." The words hung in the air between us, transmitted across miles of wire and wireless signals, but landing with the force of a physical impact. Julian and Sarah had moved in together after graduation. It had seemed like the natural, inevitable next step for the golden couple. I had helped him move his boxes, had feigned an enthusiasm I didn't feel, because I wanted him to be happy. And he had been, I thought. But now this. The tectonic plates were shifting again. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice low and steady, a deliberate counterpoint to the tremor in his. "I don't know. Walking. It's raining." "Come here," I said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a command, an instinct. "Just come to my place." Now, he didn't argue. 45 minutes later, he was standing on my doorstep, looking like a ghost. He was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale and hollowed out in the harsh light of the hallway. He was shivering, but I knew it wasn't just from the cold. He looked lost, utterly and completely adrift on an ocean of pain I could only begin to imagine. I didn't say anything. I just pulled him inside, wrapped him in the warmest, driest blanket I owned, and sat him down on the couch. He didn't speak for almost an hour. He just sat there, staring at the opposite wall, the blanket clutched around him like a life raft. I made him tea, a sweet, milky brew that I knew he liked. He took the mug, his hands trembling slightly, and the warmth seemed to thaw something in him. And then he started to talk. The words came out in a torrent, a jumbled, heartbroken narrative of things left unsaid, of growing apart, of the slow, quiet death of a love he had thought was forever. He spoke of his own failings, of the ways he had taken her for granted, of the pressures of his new high-stress consulting job that had made him distant and unavailable. He wasn't looking for absolution or advice. He was just excavating his own grief, laying the pieces out one by one, trying to make sense of the wreckage. And I listened. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I provided the silence, the still point. I was his harbor in the truest sense of the word, a safe place for his ship to ride out the storm. He talked until his voice was hoarse and the sky outside my window had begun to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn. When he finally fell silent, his eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, the sheer emotional exhaustion radiating from him like heat. "You should get some sleep," I said softly. He just nodded, a slow, heavy movement. "Can I?" He trailed off, looking around my small apartment as if just now remembering where he was. "Can I just stay here? On the couch?" "Don't be an idiot," I said, my voice gentler than my words. "You're taking my bed. I'll take the couch." He tried to protest, but he had no fight left in him. I led him to my bedroom, a small, Spartan space dominated by a queen-sized bed and shelves overflowing with photography books. He collapsed onto the mattress without even taking off his damp clothes. I gently pulled off his wet shoes and socks, covered him with a duvet, and left him there, closing the door softly behind me. That night, I lay on my own couch, listening to the rain and the sound of my best friend's broken heart, and I felt my own heart breaking right along with it, for reasons both selfless and selfish, a tangled knot of empathy and a terrible, secret hope I was ashamed to even acknowledge. That was the night the shift began. He had come to my harbor, and I didn't know it then, but he would never fully leave. In the weeks that followed, my apartment became his sanctuary. He'd come over straight from work, his suit still immaculate, his tie slightly loosened, but with a weariness in his eyes that his polished exterior couldn't hide. He hated going back to his own apartment, the one he had shared with Sarah. He said it was too quiet, that her absence was a physical presence in every room, a ghost that haunted the spaces she used to fill. So he came to mine. At first, it was just for dinner. I'd cook something simple, and we'd eat at my small kitchen table, the conversation stilted at times, circling the edges of his grief without ever diving back into the depths of that first night. He was trying to build a new routine, and I had become the central pillar of it. Then, the movie night started. It was his idea, a way to fill the long, quiet evenings. "Let's just watch something stupid," he'd say, and I'd agree. We'd sit on my worn-out corduroy couch, a bowl of popcorn between us, and lose ourselves in mindless action films or comedies that required zero emotional investment. The couch wasn't large. To sit comfortably, our shoulders would sometimes brush, our knees would knock. In the before time, before Sarah left, there would have been an immediate, almost unconscious correction, a slight shift away to reestablish the unspoken boundary of personal space. But now, that correction didn't happen. The small points of contact would linger. A casual touch that lasted a second too long. A shared space that was no longer buffered by an invisible wall. I told myself it meant nothing. He was grieving. He was lonely. He needed comfort, human contact, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone in the world. I was his friend. This was what friends did. I repeated these rationalizations to myself like a mantra, a shield against the hope that was beginning to unfurl in the most protected corners of my heart. I was determined to be what he needed me to be, a safe, platonic constant. To read anything more into it felt predatory, like taking advantage of his vulnerability. So I sat perfectly still, my entire being focused on not reacting, on not letting my own desperate yearning leak out and poison the fragile trust he was placing in me. The ritual began subtly, as most profound changes do. One night, about a month into this new routine, we were watching some sprawling historical epic. It was long, and Julian was exhausted. I saw his eyelids getting heavy, his head starting to nod. Then, slowly, tentatively, his head drooped sideways until it came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending fired at once. The point of contact, the weight of his head, the warmth seeping through the fabric of my t-shirt, it was overwhelming. I could feel the soft strands of his hair against my neck. I held my breath, waiting for him to realize what he'd done and pull away with a self-conscious laugh. But he didn't. He just sighed, a soft, weary sound, and settled more comfortably, nestling into the space as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He was asleep within minutes. I sat there, pinned in place, for the entire remainder of the 3-hour film, my arm going numb, my muscles screaming in protest. I didn't dare move. I just watched the flickering screen, the light dancing on his sleeping face, and listened to the sound of his steady breathing. It was the most exquisite torture I had ever known. My heart was a symphony of contradictions, soaring with a terrifying joy while simultaneously being crushed by the certainty that this was a mirage, a moment of unconscious comfort that he would never allow if he were awake. That night set the precedent. It became our new normal. He would arrive, we would eat, we would settle onto the couch, and at some point, he would drift off to sleep, his head finding its now familiar place on my shoulder. The initial shock on my part never fully faded, but it was joined by a kind of placid acceptance. This was the role I was to play. I was his pillow, his human tranquilizer. The physical boundary between us had been redrawn, not by a conscious decision, but by his subconscious need for comfort. It was a territory filled with ambiguity, a gray area where I was constantly on high alert, analyzing every breath, every shift in weight, searching for meaning in actions that probably had none. The escalation was so gradual, I almost didn't notice it happening. The head on my shoulder became an arm slung around my waist. The arm around my waist became him shifting his entire body, turning towards me, his legs tangled with mine, his face sometimes buried in my chest. He never did this when he was fully awake. It was always a slow, sleepy migration, an act committed under the plausible deniability of exhaustion. And I, the quiet observer, let it happen. I was a scientist studying a strange and beautiful new phenomenon, afraid that any sudden movement would startle it away forever. I lived for those evenings, and I dreaded them. They were a balm on the raw wound of my loneliness and a constant, painful reminder of what I couldn't have. He would sleep against me for hours, and I would be suspended in a state of heightened awareness, cataloging every sensation, the heat of his body, the scent of his skin, the rhythmic puff of his breath against my neck. It was an intimacy so profound, so intensely physical, that it felt more real than any actual romantic relationship I had ever had. But it was built on a foundation of sand, on his grief and my silence. I knew that one day the storm would pass, he would heal, and he would wake up, truly wake up, and realized the lines he had crossed. He would pull away, and the chasm would return, wider and more permanent than ever before. The fear of that day was a constant, cold knot in my stomach. One particular night, the ritual shifted again. A cold front had moved in, and a bitter, driving rain lashed against the windows of my apartment. The wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to seep through the walls. We were huddled on the couch under a thick wool blanket, the only light coming from the television. Julian was quieter than usual, a deep, melancholic mood having settled over him. He hadn't said much all evening. He fell asleep faster than usual, but his sleep was restless. He whimpered, a small, wounded sound, and shifted, burrowing deeper against me as if seeking refuge from a bad dream. Instinctively, without thinking, I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer, my hand coming to rest on the back of his head, my fingers tangling in his soft hair. He stilled instantly. The tension left his body, and he let out a long, slow breath, melting against me completely. My heart stopped. This was different. Before, I had been a passive recipient of his need for comfort. This time, I had actively participated. I had reached for him. I had crossed a line of my own. I waited, my blood pounding in my ears, for him to recoil. But he just slept, peaceful and secure in my embrace. My arm stayed where it was, cradling his head, my other arm holding him tight. For the first time, it felt less like he was leaning on me and more like we were holding each other. A small, almost imperceptible shift, but in the delicate ecosystem of our unspoken arrangement, it was a seismic event. The ground was no longer just changing, it was giving way. This new phase of our ritual continued for weeks, an unspoken agreement forged in sleep and sadness. He would seek my embrace, and I would give it, our bodies fitting together with a familiarity that felt both ancient and brand new. The plausible deniability was wearing thin, at least for me. It was becoming harder and harder to pretend this was just friendship. The way he would sometimes murmur my name in his sleep, the way his hand would find mine under the blanket and his fingers would lace with my own, these were not the actions of a man seeking simple, platonic comfort. Or perhaps they were, and I was just a desperate, foolish romantic, projecting my own desires onto the blank screen of his grief. The not knowing was a constant, low-grade torture. I began to feel like I was living a double life. There was the us that existed in the daylight, friends who talked about work and sports and the mundane details of our lives. And then there was the us that existed in the blue-gray twilight of my living room, two bodies tangled together in a silent, intimate dance that had no name. I would watch him in the daylight, laughing with a coworker on the phone or concentrating on an article on his tablet, and I would wonder if he had any memory of the night before. Did he wake up in his own bed in the morning with the ghost of my arms around him? Did he feel the echo of our closeness? Or did his mind simply edit it out, filing it away as a dream or a trick of his exhausted imagination? He never mentioned it. Not once. And I was too afraid to ask. To speak of it would be to give it a name, to force it into the light, and I was terrified that, like a photograph overexposed, the harsh light of reality would bleach it out completely, leaving nothing behind. The crossing happened on a Thursday. There was nothing remarkable about the day. It was gray and cold, the city shrouded in a persistent November drizzle. Julian had a terrible day at work. A project he'd been working on for months had hit a major snag, and he'd had a brutal confrontation with his boss. He arrived at my door looking defeated, the confident energy that was so central to his being completely extinguished. He barely spoke during dinner, just pushed food around his plate. The silence in the apartment felt heavy, saturated with his frustration and exhaustion. "Let's just not watch anything," he said, his voice flat, as we moved to the living room. "Can we just sit?" "Of course," I replied. We sat on the couch, the television off for the first time in months. The only sounds were the rain against the glass and the hum of the refrigerator. The silence was different this time, not empty, but full of everything we hadn't been saying. He didn't immediately lean against me. He sat at his end of the couch, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. I watched him, my heart aching with his silent misery. I wanted to reach out, to pull him into my arms and tell him it would be okay, but the absence of our usual ritual, the lack of the television's distraction, made the act feel too deliberate, too intentional. After a long time, He sighed and leaned back, his head hitting the cushions with a soft thud. He turned his head and looked at me, really looked at me. His gaze was direct, unguarded, and filled with a raw, searching vulnerability that made my breath catch. The blue-gray light from the window illuminated his face, and I could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. But there was something else there too, something new. A question. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." "For what?" I managed my own voice tight. "For this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the space between us. "For being here. I don't know what I would have done these last few months without you." "You would have been fine," I said, deflecting, because his sincerity was too much to bear. "You're the strongest person I know." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "No, I'm not. I just pretend to be." He paused, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're the strong one. You're just solid. You're like an anchor." He used my own metaphor for myself, and it felt like he had reached into my chest and touched the very core of me. We sat there for another long moment, locked in that gaze, the air crackling with a sudden, palpable tension. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the few feet of space on that couch. I could feel my pulse in my throat. He shifted then, moving closer. Not in a sleepy, unconscious way, but with a clear, undeniable purpose. He closed the distance between us until our knees were touching, until I could feel the warmth of his body. He raised a hand, and I thought he was going to touch my shoulder, a friendly gesture, but instead, his fingers brushed against my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was feather-light, tentative, yet it sent a wildfire racing through my veins. My carefully constructed walls, all the defenses I had built over the years, crumbled to dust in that single, gentle touch. His eyes flickered down to my mouth and then back up to meet my gaze. The question in his eyes was clearer now, more urgent. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Leo, would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The rain, the city, the passage of time, it all just ceased to exist. All that was left was his question, hanging in the air between us, a fragile, terrifying, beautiful thing. He was giving me a choice. He was giving me an out. I could have said no. I could have laughed it off, made a joke, pretended he was delirious with exhaustion. I could have saved our friendship, preserved the safe, predictable world we had always known. But as I looked at him, at the genuine, soul-bearing vulnerability in his eyes, at the hope and fear warring on his face, I knew I didn't want to be safe. I wanted this. I had wanted this for years, in a way that was a fundamental, defining part of who I was. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. A slow, small, almost imperceptible nod, but it was enough. The relief that washed over his face was a physical thing, like a cloud passing from the sun. He leaned in, and the last few inches that separated us felt like an eternity. His movements were hesitant, uncertain, as if he were afraid I might still bolt. His lips met mine, and it wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a confession. It was soft and gentle and breathtakingly tender. It tasted of salt and rain and a sorrow that was finally giving way to something else. It was the quietest, most earth-shattering moment of my life. He was kissing me, and I was kissing him back. The fault line had ruptured, and the whole world was being remade. The kiss ended as gently as it began. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our bodies still touching, the echo of the kiss a warm, vibrating presence on my lips. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean of all the overanalysis, all the fear, all the carefully constructed scenarios. There was only the here and now, the solid reality of his forehead against mine, his hand still cupping my jaw. For the first time in months, the silence between us wasn't filled with ambiguity or unspoken tension. It was filled with a fragile, shimmering peace. But peace is a delicate thing. As the minutes stretched on, the world began to rush back in. The sound of the rain, the reality of what had just happened. I could feel a tremor starting in his hand, a subtle vibration of uncertainty. He pulled away completely, retreating to his side of the couch, the space between us suddenly feeling like a mile-wide canyon. He wouldn't look at me. He stared down at his own hands, which were clenched in his lap. The shimmering peace shattered, replaced by a cold, prickling dread. "Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, a sharp, jerky movement. I'm sorry," he mumbled, the words directed at the floor. "I shouldn't have done that. I don't know what I was thinking." Each word was a shard of ice in my chest. I had misinterpreted everything. The months of closeness, the searching look in his eyes, the whispered question. It was all just a product of his grief and confusion. A mistake. An impulse he already regretted. The hope that had soared so high just moments before came crashing down, leaving a wreckage of humiliation and pain. I felt foolish, exposed, my years of secret longing laid bare, and then immediately dismissed. I'm so messed up right now, Leo," he continued, still not looking at me, his voice ragged. "With Sarah, and work, and everything. I'm not. This isn't. I'm straight." That last sentence landed with the finality of a slamming door. A coffin lid. It was a label, a definition, a wall thrown up between us so high and so thick that nothing could possibly get through. He had kissed me with a tenderness that had unmade my world, and now he was telling me it was a fiction, a symptom of some other illness. The whiplash was nauseating. "I should go," he said, standing up abruptly. He moved towards the door like a man escaping a burning building. He didn't even grab his coat. "Julian, wait," I said, finding my voice. It came out stronger than I expected, laced with an anger that surprised me. It was the anger of a heart that had been offered something beautiful only to have it snatched away and declared meaningless. He stopped with his hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking now. "Don't you dare apologize. And don't you dare call that nothing. You don't get to do that. You don't get to use me as your emotional life raft for months, to sleep in my arms every night, to kiss me like you meant it, and then tell me you're straight and walk out the door. You don't get to do that to me." The silence that followed was absolute. I had never spoken to him like that before. My role was the quiet observer, the calm anchor. I had just revealed the depths of my own hurt, my own investment in the intimacy he had initiated. I had laid all my cards on the table, and I was terrified to see his reaction. He finally turned around, and his face was a mask of anguish. He looked utterly lost, his eyes wide with a pain and confusion that mirrored my own. "I don't know what's happening, Leo," he whispered, and his voice broke. "I don't understand any of it." He took a step back towards me, his hand falling away from the door. "I'm straight," he repeated, but this time it didn't sound like a declaration. It sounded like a desperate question, like he was trying to convince himself. "So why can't I stop thinking about you? Why does it feel like you're the only thing that makes sense right now? Why can't I stop staring at your mouth?" The confession hung between us, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't an answer, and it wasn't a solution, but it was the truth. His truth. A messy, contradictory, terrifying truth. He wasn't dismissing what had happened. He was drowning in it. The anger in my chest dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of himself. He looked utterly broken, like a man staring into an abyss that had just opened at his feet. And I realized in that moment that this was no longer just about my feelings. It was about his. He was the one who was adrift now, and I had a choice. I could let my own hurt and anger take over, or I could be what I had always been for him. An anchor. "Then stay," I said, my voice soft again. "Just stay? We don't have to figure it all out tonight. Just don't run away." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and I held his gaze, trying to pour all the patience and reassurance I could muster into it. He was scared. We both were. But the idea of him walking out that door, of us leaving things in this broken, unresolved state, was infinitely more terrifying. He hesitated for a long moment, his internal battle playing out on his face. Then, with a slow, exhausted sigh, he nodded. He walked back to the couch and sank into it, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He didn't come close to me. He stayed on his side, and I stayed on mine. The space between us was back, but it was different now. It wasn't a space of unspoken rules or platonic boundaries. It was a space of fear and confusion, but it was also a space that held a shared, acknowledged truth. He had kissed me, and he didn't know why, and he had admitted it. That was everything. He didn't sleep at my place that night. After an hour of sitting in a thick, charged silence, He said he needed to go home, to be in his own space and think. I didn't try to stop him. When he left, the apartment felt cavernously empty. The ghost of his presence, of our closeness, lingered on the couch, but now it was tainted with the sting of his confusion and my own uncertainty. I replayed our conversation over and over in my head, dissecting every word, every inflection. "I'm straight," the words echoed, a cruel counterpoint to the memory of his kiss. But they were followed by, "So why can't I stop staring at your mouth?" It was a paradox, a contradiction that held both the potential for immense pain and a sliver of impossible hope. The next few days were agonizing. He didn't call or text. The silence from his end was absolute, a digital void that my anxious mind rushed to fill with the worst possible scenarios. He regretted it all. He was disgusted with himself and with me. He was reevaluating our entire friendship, seeing it now through a distorted lens, wondering if I had been manipulating him all along. My own carefully guarded heart, which I had so bravely opened, now felt raw and exposed to the elements. I found it impossible to concentrate on my work. The world outside my lens seemed dull and gray. The only image my mind could conjure was his face in that last moment before he left, torn and afraid. I gave him 3 days. 3 days of pacing my apartment, of checking my phone every 30 seconds, of battling the urge to reach out and demand an answer. I knew he needed space. I knew this was a cataclysm for his self-perception, for the entire narrative he had built for his life. I had to give him the room to process it. But on the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I deserved to know where we stood, even if the answer was one I didn't want to hear. My fear of losing him was immense, but the pain of living in this limbo was becoming unbearable. I found him at the university pool. It was a place he often went when he was stressed, swimming lap after relentless lap to quiet his mind. I stood on the observation deck, watching his familiar form cut through the water. He moved with a desperate, furious energy, his strokes powerful and punishing, as if he were trying to outrun the thoughts in his own head. He didn't see me. I watched him for a long time, until his pace finally slowed, until he came to a stop, hanging onto the edge of the pool, his chest heaving, his head bowed in exhaustion. I walked down to the pool deck, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous, humid space. He heard me and looked up. His eyes, when they met mine, were haunted. "Leo," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We need to talk, Julian," I said, my voice calm and even, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "Not here. Let's go somewhere quiet." He just nodded, pulling himself from the water. He wrapped a towel around his waist and followed me out into the cold evening air, not saying a word. We ended up at a small, empty park nearby, sitting on a cold metal bench under the weak orange glow of a street lamp. He was shivering, his wet hair dripping onto his shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice the cold. "I've been going out of my mind," he said finally, his voice low. "I haven't slept. I keep replaying it. The kiss. What you said. What I said." I waited, letting him speak. "Everything you said was right," he continued, staring at the frozen ground. "About me using you. Not consciously. I swear, I never. But that's what I was doing. I was so lost after Sarah, and you were just there. You were safe. And I took that, and I twisted it into something else, and I leaned on you until I broke something." He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I am so sorry, Leo, for hurting you." My heart twisted. This was what I had feared, that he would frame it all as a mistake, a moment of weakness born of grief. "Is that what you think it was?" I asked, my voice quiet. "A mistake?" He hesitated, a long, agonizing pause. "I don't know what it was," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "That's the problem. I've spent my whole life being one thing. I like girls. I date girls. Sarah, I loved her. That was real. My life had a blueprint. And then you." He ran a hand through his wet hair, a gesture of pure exasperation. "Nothing with you fits the blueprint. The way I feel when I'm with you. This sense of quiet, of peace. The way I started to need to be near you, to touch you. I told myself it was because I was sad, because I was lonely. It was easier than admitting that it felt right. It felt more right than almost anything ever has." His confession washed over me, a wave of warmth against the cold night air. He wasn't rejecting it. He was trying, clumsily, painfully, to understand it. That night, he went on, his gaze distant, when I kissed you, it wasn't an impulse. I'd been wanting to do it for weeks. Every time you'd look at me in a certain way, every time my head was on your shoulder and I could feel you breathe, I wanted to. And it terrified me, because it meant the blueprint was wrong. It meant that I was not the person I thought I was. So you panicked, I said, understanding dawning. When you said you were straight, I was grabbing for the blueprint, he finished, nodding. I was trying to force the world to make sense again. It was a stupid, cruel thing to say to you, right after. I was scared, Leo. I was scared of what it meant about me, and I was scared of what it would do to us. To our friendship. It's the most important thing in my life. The idea of losing it is, he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. We sat in silence for a moment, the cold air thick with his honesty. He had laid his own heart bare now, with all its confusion and fear. He had shown me the map of his inner world, and it was a territory in upheaval, the coastlines being redrawn, the old landmarks washed away. You're not going to lose me, I said softly. You could never lose me. He finally met my eyes again, and I could see tears welling there, mingling with the water from his hair. But what is this? He asked, his voice cracking. What do we do now? I don't know how to be this. I don't have a map for it. I reached out and took his hand. It was freezing cold. I wrapped my own hands around it, trying to warm him. Then we draw a new one, I said. Together. We don't have to have a name for it. We don't have to have a destination. We just have to stop being afraid of the journey. I squeezed his hand. All I know, Julian, is that when you kissed me, it felt like coming home. And I know I've been in love with you for years. That's my truth. I can't pretend it isn't. The admission, spoken aloud for the first time, felt both terrifying and liberating. I had given him all of me, with no guarantees. A single tear traced a path down his cold cheek. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, his fingers tightened around mine. I don't know if I'm in love with you, he said, and the words should have hurt, but they were spoken with such raw, brutal honesty that they didn't. I don't know what I am, but I know that I need you. I know that when I'm with you, the noise in my head stops. I know that I want to kiss you again, and I think, he took a deep, shuddering breath. I think that has to be enough to start with. It was more than enough. The journey back from that park bench was slow and tentative. We were charting a new territory, and we moved with the caution of explorers in an unknown land. There were no grand declarations, no immediate shift into a conventional relationship. It was a process of quiet negotiation, of learning a new language of touch and affection that was deliberate and consensual, free from the shadows of grief and ambiguity. He started staying over again, but it was different now. The question was always there, spoken or unspoken. Is this okay? He would ask it with his eyes before he rested his head on my shoulder. I would answer with a small nod, a soft smile. The first time he stayed the night in my bed was a week after our talk in the park. We had been lying on the couch, wrapped in our usual embrace, but we were both wide awake. He had been talking about his day, his head on my chest, his voice a low rumble. When a comfortable silence fell, he tilted his head back to look at me. I don't want to go home, he said softly. You don't have to, I replied. Can I stay with you? He asked, and the subtext was clear. He didn't mean on the couch. My heart did a familiar lurch. Yes, I said, my voice steady. I want you to. There was a nervousness to it, a shared vulnerability as we moved to the bedroom. We changed into sleep clothes in a shy, respectful silence. When we finally lay down in my bed, we started on opposite sides, a careful distance between us. The space felt charged, a test of this new ground we were on. After a moment, I felt him shift. Leo, he whispered in the dark. Yeah. Can I? I knew what he was asking. I turned onto my side to face him and opened my arms. He moved into them without hesitation, his body fitting against mine as if it were made to be there. He buried his face in my neck, and I felt him sigh, a deep, shuddering release of tension, of weeks of fear and uncertainty. I held him close, my hand stroking his back, and for the first time, it felt completely, unequivocally right. There was no pretense, no plausible deniability. Just two people choosing to hold each other through the night. We didn't kiss. We didn't do anything more. We just held on, and it was the most intimate, most profound experience of my life. I fell asleep that night feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible, a quiet certainty that we were, finally, heading in the right direction. We were drawing our own map, one gentle touch at a time. We began to build a new kind of domesticity, a life woven together in the small moments. Making coffee for him in the morning just the way he liked it. The comfortable silence as we read in the same room, my photography books and his programming manuals. The way he started leaving things at my apartment. A toothbrush, a change of clothes, his favorite hoodie, staking a small, quiet claim on the space, turning my apartment into our home. He never used the word boyfriend. I never used the word love again. We let the labels go, focusing instead on the reality of what we were building. It was a structure founded on honesty and patience, built brick by brick with small acts of care and quiet affection. The physical side of our relationship unfolded with the same gentle, unhurried pace. Kisses were soft and searching, often ending with our foreheads pressed together, just breathing. Touch was about comfort and reassurance, a hand on the small of his back, his fingers lacing through mine as we walked down the street at night. He was discovering a new side of himself, and I was giving him the space and safety to do so without pressure or expectation. Some days, I could feel his fear and uncertainty resurface, a subtle withdrawal, a return of the distance between us. On those days, I learned not to push. I would simply be there, a steady presence, and wait for him to find his way back to me. And he always did. One Saturday afternoon, months later, we were in my darkroom. The red safe light cast a warm, intimate glow over the small space. I was showing him how to develop a print, guiding his hands as he gently agitated the tray of developer. We watched as an image slowly began to appear on the blank paper, a black and white shot I had taken of the city skyline at dawn. He was mesmerized by the process, by the magic of an image emerging from nothing. "It's like it was always there," he said, his voice hushed with awe, "just waiting for the right conditions to be seen." I looked at him, at his face illuminated in the soft red light, his eyes wide with wonder, and my heart felt full to bursting. He was talking about the photograph, but he was also talking about us, about the thing that had always been there between us, hidden in the shadows, just waiting for the right conditions, the honesty, the vulnerability, the courage to finally be brought into the light. He turned to look at me, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across his face. He didn't have to say anything. I didn't either. In the quiet, creative space of my darkroom, surrounded by the scent of chemicals and the magic of an emerging image, we understood. He leaned in and kissed me, and this time, there was no hesitation, no question. It was a kiss of certainty, of arrival. It tasted of peace, and of a future we were creating together, a photograph developing into a beautiful, honest life. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. The sharp edges of his grief for a life he thought he wanted began to soften, and the long-aching loneliness in my own heart began to recede. We found our rhythm, a gentle cadence of shared days and peaceful nights. We learned that a home isn't a place with four walls, but a feeling of safety you build inside another person. And we discovered that love isn't about having a perfect map, but about having the courage to navigate the wilderness hand in hand, drawing your own path as you go, finding your way not toward a pre-drawn destination, but simply toward each other.